The first comment about my marriage came over coffee on an ordinary Thursday morning. We were at a restaurant near the marina in Bellevue. Nothing special. Clean windows, low music, the smell of toast, and burnt espresso drifting over from the counter. My mother-in-law set her cup down, looked at me across the table, and said, "Ethan needs someone who's actually built a life, Claire. Not someone who picks fabrics and moves lamps around." She said it in a steady voice, like she was offering weather. My husband did not look up right away. He was reading something on his phone. Then he reached for the cream, stirred it into his coffee, and said nothing at all. I remember the spoon against the cup. That small metal sound. I remember smoothing the napkin in my lap and deciding, in that moment, not to help him. That was months before a woman named Laura Finch called me one morning and asked, very carefully, if I had a few minutes to talk about title records. At the time, though, it was just breakfast. Just coffee. Just a sentence hanging in the air while the server passed behind us carrying a tray of plates. I should start earlier. Not with the call. Not with the paperwork. Earlier than that. Back when I still thought being quiet was the same thing as being generous. 3 years into our marriage, I was already used to the shape of Ethan's assumptions. He worked in software. Long hours, investor calls, numbers on screens, deadlines that seemed to follow him into every room. He liked to say he was building something from the ground up, and to be fair, he was. I respected that. I still do. I had my own company by then, although that is not how he thought about it. My mornings usually began before his. I liked the house when it was still. The kitchen tiles cool under my feet. The hum of the refrigerator. The first gray light settling across the counters. On that particular Tuesday, I had been up since a little after 5, reviewing projections for a redevelopment project just outside Tacoma. 2 parcels were already under contract. A third had finally come through the night before. By the time Ethan came in, I had finished 1 call, answered 3 emails, and moved a stack of lender notes to the far end of the table so there would be room for breakfast. He poured coffee, glanced at his phone, and sat down across from me. I told him I had a meeting that afternoon with a commercial lender. I said the project had grown into something larger than I first expected. I said maybe sometime I should walk him through what Alder Ridge Holdings actually did, because I realized I had never really shown him the full picture. He looked up with that patient expression people use when they think they are being kind. "Babe," he said, "you don't have to make it sound bigger than it is." I did not answer. He reached for my hand, gave it a quick squeeze, then let go. "I think it's great you've made a little business out of the design work," he said. "Really. I just don't want you stressing yourself out with lender meetings and finance stuff that's outside your lane. Outside your lane." He said it gently. That was the part that stayed with me. He took a sip of coffee and kept going. "If you want, I can introduce you to someone who helps small business owners get organized. Somebody solid. They could probably save you a lot of time." The meeting on my calendar that afternoon was for a construction facility just over $4 million. The lender was flying in from Portland because my company had a long enough record and enough clean history to make the deal worth the trip. I looked at Ethan across the breakfast table, at the open phone beside his plate, at the half-buttoned cuff of his shirt, at the easy confidence of a man who believed he understood the entire structure because he had seen one wall of it. "That would be helpful," I said. He smiled, relieved by how simple I had made it for him. "Of course." Then he went back to his phone. I never brought it up again. That was the morning I understood something I probably should have understood sooner. Ethan did not want a wife whose work might change the balance in the room. He wanted someone adjacent to ambition. Someone decorative enough to admire it, organized enough not to interrupt it, and small enough that he would never have to measure himself against her. So I stopped explaining. I let him think I spent my days choosing tile, reviewing finishes, and helping friends stage properties they were trying to sell. Sometimes I did those things. I also reviewed purchase agreements, negotiated lease language, tracked county filings, and built a company slowly enough that no one mistook patience for absence. I put the phone face down. Then I waited. By the start of that winter, Ethan's company had closed a funding round he had been chasing for almost 2 years, and something in the house began to shift. The change was not dramatic at first. It came in pieces. New dinner reservations. New names I had never heard before. Men who spoke in short, confident sentences and women who wore cashmere even when it was warm. There were weekends in Woodinville, a private club membership, and a kind of casual talk about rooms that matter, as if the rest of the world had been divided into useful people and background furniture. Ethan did not become cruel overnight. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he became selective with recognition. At parties, he would introduce me with a hand at my back and say, "Claire has a design business." Not unkindly, just efficiently, like he was assigning me a category before someone asked a question that might take too long to answer. Then the conversation would move on to cap tables, burn rates, commercial leasing, city growth corridors. Topics I knew well enough to join, and often better than the people discussing them. I rarely did. That was my mistake for a while. I kept confusing restraint with wisdom. His mother, Diane, was less careful. She had the polished manners of someone who believed bluntness counted as honesty if it arrived in a calm enough voice. After the funding round, she stopped pretending to be curious about me and became openly comparative instead. At one dinner, she brought up a woman named Alina whose husband had just sold a medical software company. At another, she mentioned the daughter of a family friend who had made partner, not someone who picks fabrics and moves lamps around. Ethan could have stopped it with one sentence. He could have said, "That's enough." He could have said, "You don't know what you're talking about." He could have even said, "Mom, not now." Instead, he checked his phone. When we got home that day, the house was quiet except for the dishwasher. Late afternoon light came through the back windows in long pale strips across the floor. Ethan loosened his collar, poured himself a drink, and stood by the sink without looking at me. I was putting groceries away. Lemons in the bowl, greens in the crisper, eggs on the top shelf. I remember the sound of the refrigerator door closing. He said, "She means well." I turned and looked at him. "Does she?" He exhaled, already tired of the conversation he had chosen not to prevent. "She's not always graceful, but she sees things clearly." There was a pause after that, long enough for me to understand there was more. He swirled the ice in his glass once and kept his eyes on the window. "My world is changing, Claire. The company's at a different level now. There are expectations." Expectations. It was a clean word, a useful word. It made everything sound professional and unavoidable. I did not ask what he meant. I already knew. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Not emotionally, structurally. That is the best way I can explain it. When people think they are moving toward a decision, they begin leaving traces. A second calendar. Calls taken outside. New passwords. Small shifts in routine that look meaningless until you line them up. I noticed Ethan taking more calls from the backyard with the sliding door pulled almost shut. I noticed he started printing documents at home instead of the office. I noticed he met his mother twice for dinner on weeknights and mentioned it afterward, as if the timing did not matter because the fact itself had been disclosed. One Wednesday afternoon, I was in my office reviewing easement language for one of our Tacoma parcels when I heard his voice through the gap in the door behind me. "I just need to understand the process," he said. A pause. Timeline, documentation, what's realistic? His tone was flat in a way that told me he was trying not to sound invested. I did not get up. I did not go to the door. I minimized the document on my screen and opened the internal records for Alder Ridge Holdings instead. 3 commercial buildings, 2 multifamily properties, 1 townhouse development held through a subsidiary LLC, and the house we were living in, purchased before our marriage and titled under the company. Ethan's name was nowhere on any ownership document. It never had been. He was listed on 2 household accounts and on nothing that would survive a title search. I sat there for a while with my hands folded in front of the keyboard, listening to the low sound of his voice outside and the faint ticking of the wall clock near my desk. Then I started making copies. Formation documents, deeds, closing statements, annual reports, tax returns, membership records, clean scans labeled by year, backed up to 2 drives. Not because I was afraid of the truth, because I have learned that truth, left loose, gets handled badly. That evening, Ethan came in smiling, set his keys in the tray by the door, and kissed my forehead like any other night. I asked how his day had gone. He said, productive. I nodded and brought plates to the table. Then I waited. A few days later, I saw the first name. Ethan had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he stepped into the garage to take a call. The screen lit up when a message arrived. Documents look solid. We can move forward when you're ready. The contact name was Martin Hale, attorney. I did not touch the phone. I simply stood there for a moment, looking at the words on the screen while the coffee machine clicked quietly behind me. Then I opened my own phone, took a photograph of the message, and set Ethan's phone back exactly where it had been. That evening, I called someone I trusted. Her name was Laura Benton, and she had been my roommate for 2 years in college before she decided she preferred the clarity of law school to architecture. 15 years later, she had become one of the more precise family attorneys in Washington state. We met at her office on a Thursday morning. The building smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. The receptionist brought coffee. Laura closed the door behind us and sat across the desk with a legal pad already open. I assume this isn't a social visit, she said. I slid the folder toward her. Inside were copies of everything that mattered. The formation documents for Alder Ridge Holdings, property deeds, operating agreements, tax filings, membership records, purchase timelines. Laura read carefully, the way good attorneys do, slowly enough that nothing gets missed. Every few pages she would pause, tap the corner of the document once, and continue. It took almost 40 minutes before she finally leaned back. You built this before the marriage, she said. Yes. And everything stayed under the company structure. Yes. And he's never been a member of the LLC. No, she nodded once, almost approvingly. Then the situation is very simple, she said. I waited. If your husband is planning to file for divorce based on the assumption that these are marital assets, that assumption does not exist in any legal record. She tapped the folder lightly. This structure is extremely clean. I did not feel proud when she said that. I felt calm. What would you recommend? I asked. Laura thought about it for a moment. Let him proceed. I raised an eyebrow. If someone builds a legal argument on incorrect assumptions, she continued, the most efficient correction is letting the argument finish forming. She closed the folder and slid it back to me. The further he goes, the clearer the correction becomes. There was something almost mathematical about the way she said it. I went home after that meeting and made dinner. Ethan arrived around 7. He looked tired, but pleased in the way he often did after a day of meetings. He kissed my cheek and loosened his tie. How was your day? He asked. Busy, I said. He told me about a product launch timeline and an investor call scheduled for the following week. I listened and asked questions when they made sense. Nothing about the evening felt unusual, but the weeks that followed had a particular energy to them. You can feel it when someone believes they are approaching an outcome. Ethan began organizing paperwork in his office. I could hear the printer running late at night. He took longer calls in the car before coming inside. One afternoon, while he was at work, I stepped into his office to leave a package that had arrived for him. That was when I saw the legal pad on his desk. 2 columns. His handwriting neat and careful. On the left side, he had written assets. On the right side, he had written division. The house appeared near the top of the list with an estimated market value next to it. Under that, he had written the joint accounts. Then his company equity. All of those items were placed under his column. Farther down the page, he had written my name. Next to it was a number. $55,000, estimated design income. I stood there looking at that number for a long time. Last year, Alder Ridge Holdings had generated $412,000 in distributions. The year before it had been just over $360,000. Ethan's estimate was not simply wrong. It existed in a completely different version of reality. I took a photograph of the page. Then I placed the legal pad back exactly where it had been and left the office. I sat in the living room afterward, watching the late afternoon light move slowly across the floorboards. Not angry, not even surprised, just clear. Ethan had decided who I was years ago. And once someone builds that version of you in their mind, Every piece of information that contradicts it becomes invisible. A few days later, he asked if we could talk. It was a Sunday afternoon. We were standing in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter with his arms folded, the way he does when he wants to appear relaxed, but is actually rehearsing a speech. "I've been thinking about our future," he said. I waited. The company is moving fast now. My world is different than it was when we met. He looked past me toward the window. I need a partner who operates at the same level I do. There it was. Clean. Controlled. Reasonable. "I don't think we're compatible anymore," he said. I nodded slowly. "I understand." He seemed relieved by how calmly I said it. "I've spoken with an attorney," he added. "I want to handle this fairly. I'll make sure you're taken care of." I thought briefly about the legal pad in his office, the column where he had written my name, the number he had assigned to it. "That's thoughtful," I said. 3 days later, his attorney came to our house, and that was when things became very precise. His attorney arrived on a gray Wednesday afternoon just after 2. The sky had that flat Pacific Northwest color that makes the windows look brighter from the inside. I had been in the back room reviewing a contractor packet when the doorbell rang. By the time I reached the foyer, Ethan was already there, one hand on the knob, posture straight, face arranged into something practiced and neutral. The attorney introduced herself as Julia Mercer. She was polished, composed, and carrying a leather folder thick enough to suggest confidence. Not arrogance. Just preparation. She stepped inside, wiped a few raindrops from her sleeve, and thanked me for making time. We sat at the dining table. I remember small things from that hour more clearly than larger ones. The faint smell of rain off her coat, the hum of the recessed lights overhead, the sound of Ethan setting a glass of water in front of her a little too carefully, as though precision itself might improve the outcome. Julia opened her folder and laid out a set of documents in a tidy stack. There was a summary sheet first, then a proposed settlement, then supporting pages behind it. Ethan had clearly spent time organizing the narrative. His salary, his equity position, his contribution to household expenses, the supposed value of our home. My income, listed again as supplemental design revenue, somewhere between $55,000 and $60,000 annually, depending on which page I looked at. He had at least made the numbers consistent with his own story. Julia spoke in a calm, professional voice. She explained that Ethan wanted an efficient resolution. He wanted things handled privately. He wanted fairness. He wanted to ensure I had a stable transition. The house, she said, should remain with him based on his primary financial role in maintaining it. The joint accounts would stay with him as well, subject to a modest payment to me. My design business, such as it was, would remain mine. She paused after each section as if expecting resistance. I gave her none. I read every page carefully. Then I signed where she indicated. Julia looked up at me once, maybe twice, with a slight narrowing in her expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like recalculation. She was experienced enough to know that easy agreements are not always simple agreements. Ethan, on the other hand, looked relieved. That was the word for it. Relieved in the body, in the shoulders, in the way his hands stopped gripping the edge of the table, in the way he stood to walk Julia to the door with a little more energy than he'd had coming into the room. From the front window, I watched him speak to her beside her car. He smiled. She nodded. Then she drove away. That evening, he called his mother. I heard just enough from the hallway to understand the shape of the conversation. "Yeah," he said quietly. "No, easier than I expected." A pause. No, she didn't push back. I kept walking. That night I slept well, which surprised me. I think it was because by then I had stopped trying to manage emotion and started managing sequence. That was the shift. Not from pain to anger, from uncertainty to order. I got up the next morning at 5, as usual, and made coffee in the dark before the sun had fully come up. Then I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote 3 lines. Step 1, organize the record. Step 2, say only what is necessary. Step 3, let documents do the talking. That was all. No speeches. No arguments I would never get credit for winning. No attempt to force understanding where curiosity had never existed. I spent the next hour pulling together a complete indexed packet for Laura. Corporate formation papers, annual registrations, tax returns with the LLC income clearly disclosed, property deeds, closing files, mortgage statements, membership records, a simple asset schedule with dates. I scanned what needed scanning, labeled what needed labeling, and delivered the packet to Laura's office before noon. She called me later that afternoon. "You've made my job very easy," she said. "That was the goal." She gave a short laugh. "Good. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. No extra commentary. No emotional texts. No explanations." I wasn't planning on any. "I know," she said. "That's why I like working with you." The next several days were quiet on the surface. Ethan moved through the house with a kind of softened confidence, like a man who believed the difficult part was already behind him. He took a little longer getting ready in the mornings. He answered calls in the open instead of stepping outside. Once, while buttoning his coat near the front door, he said, "I'm glad we're handling this like adults." I said, "So am I." He nodded as though that confirmed something good about him. On Friday evening, Diane called while he was in the shower. His phone buzzed on the counter and lit up the darkening kitchen. Her name filled the screen. I looked at it for a moment, then turned away and continued drying the dishes. There is a version of me from years earlier who might have answered, or listened at doors, or searched for final proof as if proof were the same thing as peace. By then I knew better. When a structure is weak, you do not stand beneath it waiting for one more crack. You step back and let the weight reveal itself. So I kept to routine. I reviewed a lease abstract for one of the mixed-use properties. I returned a call from a lender. I met a contractor at a site in Tacoma where the ground was still damp from morning rain and the air smelled like wet soil and fresh-cut wood. I came home, changed clothes, made soup, and set the table for two out of habit. By Sunday, Laura had drafted the first response package. She told me not to send anything yet. Let them make the next move, she said. They still think they understand the map. That line stayed with me. They still think they understand the map. On Tuesday morning, a week after Julia Mercer sat at my dining table, my phone rang while I was trimming dead leaves from the rosemary by the back steps. The screen showed her name. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. And the moment I heard her voice, I knew the title search had come back. "Mrs. Bennett," Julia said, and her voice was still professional, but something in it had tightened. "I need to clarify a property issue." I set the gardening shears down on the patio table and sat in the chair nearest the door. "Of course," I said. There was a short pause. Paper moved on her end of the line. "The residence on Harborview Drive," she said carefully. "The title search shows it is held by Alder Ridge Holdings, LLC." "That's correct." Another pause. "And the company was formed before your marriage." "Yes." The silence after that was longer. Not confusion exactly. More like someone taking apart a machine and realizing the piece they need was never there. Julia continued, slower now. "We also identified additional properties held under the same company structure." "Yes, there appear to be several." "There are." She cleared her throat. "Your husband is not listed as a member, officer, or owner in any of the corporate records we've reviewed." "He isn't." This time she did not speak immediately. I could hear the faint sound of traffic on her end, maybe from an open office window, and the soft turning of pages. "Mrs. Bennett," she said at last, "the settlement documents were prepared based on information your husband provided regarding marital assets and household ownership." "I understand." "And that information was incomplete." I looked out over the smaller beds near the fence. The rosemary needed trimming. The mint had started spreading again. "I signed the documents he presented," I said. "I didn't prepare them." "Yes," she said quietly. "I can see that." There it was. The turn. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a professional mind adjusting itself to the record. I stood and walked inside, more for warmth than anything else. The kitchen was cool and smelled faintly of lemon dish soap. Morning light had reached the far counter by then. Julia spoke again. "I'll need to discuss this with my client." "Of course." "And with counsel." "Take your time." I ended the call, rinsed the dirt from my hands, and dried them with a dish towel. Then I called Laura. She answered on the second ring. It started, I said. Title search. Yes. How did she sound? Careful. Laura made a quiet, approving sound. Good. Don't contact Ethan. Don't explain anything. I'll send the occupancy notice this afternoon. That was the next step. Not emotional. Administrative. The house had never been a marital asset. Ethan had moved into a residence owned by my company. Now that he had initiated divorce proceedings and the occupancy was no longer mutual, his status became simple. Guest. Laura prepared a formal notice terminating his residential permission within the statutory period allowed. Clean language. No hostility. Just dates, authority, and process. By the time she emailed me the draft, Ethan was already on his way home. I heard his car before I saw it, then the garage door, then footsteps inside the mudroom. He came into the kitchen holding his phone. He looked different, although it took me a second to identify exactly how. Smaller was not the right word. Less certain, maybe. As though some internal support had been removed and the rest had not yet adjusted. The house, he said. I kept folding the dish towel in half, then in half again. Yes, it's in your company's name. Yes. He stared at me for a moment. You never told me that. I looked at him directly. 3 years into our marriage, I said, I told you I had a meeting with a commercial lender. I told you Alder Ridge was growing faster than I expected. I asked if you wanted me to walk you through it. He said nothing. You told me you could connect me with someone who helps small business owners get organized. Color moved into his face and then out again. That's not the same thing, he said, though without much force. It is for me. He stepped farther into the room. Claire, you made it sound like. I told you the truth, I said. My voice stayed even. That seemed to bother him more than if I had raised it. You heard something else. He opened his mouth, then closed it. For a few seconds, the kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator humming. A car passing outside. The clock over the stove clicking forward. He looked down at his phone again, probably at whatever Julia had sent, and then back at me. There have to be marital claims here, he said. I lived here. I paid for things. I covered expenses. Household expenses, I said. Which is different. His jaw tightened. I did not press. That was the important part. I did not fill the silence for him. I did not help him bridge the distance between his assumptions and the record. A few minutes later, his mother called. I could hear her voice through the phone before he even put it fully to his ear. Sharp, clipped, already moving faster than the facts. He walked into the study and shut the door, but not completely. That had always been his habit. Private enough to suggest distance. Open enough that he could still hear the house around him. I heard him say, I know, Mom. Then again, a minute later, I know. Then, there has to be something. He stayed in there nearly half an hour. When he came out, Laura's notice was already in my inbox. I printed it on the heavier paper I use for contracts. I read it once at the counter. Then again. Not because I needed to, because I like to see the sequence completed. Ethan stood near the hallway, watching me. What is that? He asked. Something for my attorney. His face changed at the word attorney. You already had counsel? Yes. For how long? Long enough. He took a step closer. So you knew. I knew you were making decisions without checking the structure you were living inside. That's not fair. I set the papers down neatly. No, I said, it's accurate. He looked at me then the way people do when they realize the conversation they expected to control has already ended somewhere else. I picked up the notice, walked past him, and slid it under the half-open study door where he had been speaking to his mother. Then I returned to the kitchen and turned off the kettle just before it started to whistle. I made tea. That was the confrontation, if you can call it that. Not a fight. Not a scene. Just two people standing in a kitchen while reality settled into place. That evening, he contacted another attorney, and then another. Over the next 10 days, the house became very quiet. Not peaceful, just careful. Ethan stopped speaking in full paragraphs. Most of what he said came in short, practical questions. Had a package arrived? Did I need the car on Thursday? Was the contractor coming back next week? He moved through the rooms like someone temporarily occupying a place he no longer understood. I kept to routine. I left early for meetings. I reviewed site reports. I answered lender emails. I made soup one night, pasta the next, and labeled 2 file boxes in my office with new property schedules for the quarter. The ordinary work steadied me. Laura called most afternoons with updates. The first attorney Ethan contacted reviewed the corporate records and declined to get involved. No useful argument was the phrase that came back through the professional chain. The second asked for tax returns, then apparently pointed out what should have been obvious from the start. Alder Ridge Holdings had been disclosed year after year. The income appeared on the returns. The entity existed in black and white. Signatures matter whether someone reads every line or not. The third attorney, the one Diane found through a friend, asked one question before anything else. When was the company formed? When he heard the answer, his advice shifted away from property and toward housing. That was how Laura put it to me, dry and precise. By then, the date for Ethan to vacate the house was fixed. He did not challenge the notice directly. I think by that point, even he understood challenge and success were not the same thing. We signed the final divorce papers a little over 3 weeks later. The conference room was smaller than I expected. Neutral walls, a long table, 2 glasses of water set out before we arrived. The blinds were half open, letting in thin afternoon light that made everything look flatter than it felt. Julia Mercer was there with a revised posture and a revised file. She was courteous to me in a more direct way now. Less performative softness, more professional respect. I appreciated that. Laura sat beside me with 1 pen, 1 folder, and 3 colored tabs marking the only pages she expected to matter. Ethan came in last. He looked tired. Not ruined. Not destroyed. Just tired in a very ordinary human way. Like someone who had spent too many nights trying to reverse something that could not be reversed. No one raised their voice. That part matters to me. So many people imagine truth arriving like a slammed door. In my experience, it usually arrives as paper, dates, signatures, and a room full of people adjusting their posture 1 inch at a time. Julia went through the revised terms. Personal accounts divided according to record. His business remained his. My companies remained mine. No claim on the Harbor View property. No claim on the development parcels. No claim on the multifamily holdings. Transitional logistics reduced to dates, itemized property, and removal deadlines. At one point, Ethan said, "I genuinely thought," then he stopped. No one helped him finish. Laura slid 1 page toward me and tapped the signature line. I signed. Ethan signed a few minutes later. That was it. No speech. No final explanation. Just the soft movement of paper and the scrape of chairs against the floor when the meeting ended. He moved out on a Friday. The morning was cold and bright. One of those clear northwest days where the air feels rinsed clean and every sound carries farther than usual. A rented truck stood in the driveway. Ethan had a friend with him, someone I had met twice before at company dinners. They loaded boxes methodically. Clothes first, then office things. Then the framed prints from the upstairs hallway, the ones he had chosen because they looked expensive without saying anything at all. Later came kitchen items he had bought himself, 2 lamps, a chair from the den, and the espresso machine his mother had given us one Christmas. I stayed mostly out of the way, not to be dramatic, just because there was nothing useful in standing there. Around noon, I walked through the front rooms with a legal pad and made a simple list. Garage remote returned. Study key returned. Mail forwarding confirmed. Alarm code changed after departure. Step by step. Nothing emotional. Just sequence. When the last box went out, Ethan came back inside once more to check the hall closet. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, hand on the knob, looking into an almost empty space. I didn't understand what any of this was, he said. I was standing near the stairs. I know. He nodded, but he did not look at me. That's all I can really say. I thought about answering with something polished, something balanced and wise. But the truth did not need much. So I said, "Take care of yourself, Ethan." He gave a short nod. Then he left. I listened to the truck door close. The engine started. Tires moved slowly over the gravel edge of the drive, then the sound faded. And the house changed. Immediately. Not because it was happier, Because it was quieter in a different way. The kind of quiet that belongs to a place no longer waiting for someone else's mood to settle. I locked the front door, slid the deadbolt into place, and stood there for a moment with my hand still on the brass. Then I went upstairs and opened every window for 15 minutes, even though the air was cold. Fresh air first. After that, I took the hallway prints down to the garage and leaned them against the wall. The pale rectangles they left behind on the paint looked oddly honest. Clear evidence that something had been there and was not there anymore. I made tea around 3. I remember the steam rising against the kitchen window and the small click of the kettle cooling on the stove. My phone rang once while I was pouring it. A developer from Seattle I had been trying to meet for nearly a year. He had heard my name from someone involved in a retail restructuring I handled the previous fall. He wanted to talk about a mixed-use project outside Tacoma. We scheduled lunch for Tuesday. By the end of that month, I hired an analyst who had been underused at a title company in Bellevue and a part-time operations manager who understood commercial timelines better than most full-time executives I had met. Alder Ridge moved out of my home office 6 weeks later and into a proper suite downtown. Not because the business had suddenly become real, because I was done letting other people mistake quiet for small. The only time Ethan contacted me after that was 4 months later. It was late in the evening. I was at my desk reviewing a proposal and his name appeared on my screen. I let it ring almost to the end before answering. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out what to say." I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the city lights beyond the window. "You don't have to say much," I told him. There was another pause. "I thought I was the ambitious one," he said. "I considered that." "You were ambitious," I said. "So was I." He did not answer right away. Then he said quietly, "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," I said. "You should have." We ended the call a minute later. No reconciliation. No repair. Just two people speaking plainly at last, after the paperwork had already done what paperwork does. By then, the truth had been established in every place that mattered. And once that happens, consequences stop feeling dramatic. They just feel final. A few weeks after Ethan moved out, I repainted the living room. That might sound small compared to everything else that had happened, but it felt like the correct place to begin. For 6 years, the walls had been a cool gray he preferred. Practical. Neutral. Designed not to offend anyone who walked into the room. I chose a warm terracotta instead. Not bold enough to feel theatrical. Just warm enough that the late afternoon light turned the walls soft and golden. The first evening after the paint dried, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea and watched the color shift slowly as the sun went down. The house felt different. Not triumphant. Not empty. Just settled. There is a quiet that only arrives when a place no longer has to carry the weight of someone else's expectations. The kitchen sounded clearer. The hallway echoed slightly when I walked through it. Even the air seemed easier to move through. Work filled most of my days after that. Once people in the local development circles understood that Alder Ridge Holdings was not a small design firm, but an operating investment company, the phone started ringing more often. Slowly at first, then steadily. One developer called about a retail corridor redevelopment that needed a different financing structure. A lender I had worked with years earlier asked if I would review a distressed property portfolio. 2 separate investors wanted meetings about a mixed-use project just south of Tacoma. None of it felt sudden to me. The work had always been there. It had simply been happening quietly. Within a few months, I hired 2 more people, an analyst named Mateo who understood tax structure better than most attorneys I had met, and an operations coordinator named Lila who could manage 3 timelines at once without raising her voice. We moved into a modest office downtown. Nothing flashy. Just a clean space with large windows and a conference table big enough for serious conversations. The first morning, I unlocked that door myself and stood inside the empty office for a minute before anyone else arrived. It reminded me of those early mornings in the kitchen years before, when the house was silent and the day had not yet decided what it was going to become. Occasionally, someone would mention Ethan. Seattle is not a large city once you start tracing the same professional circles. I heard he had pivoted his company toward a different market after investors pushed for faster returns. I heard he was spending more time traveling again. Once someone told me Diane had been explaining to people that the divorce had been a strategic realignment. I never corrected the story. It was not my responsibility anymore. Ethan called only that one time after the paperwork was finished. We spoke briefly, politely, and ended the conversation without trying to repair something that had already been measured and filed. That was enough. These days my mornings still begin early. I make coffee. I open the kitchen windows if the weather allows it. Sometimes I review contracts before heading to the office. Sometimes I walk through the garden with a pair of pruning shears and trim whatever has grown too far in one direction. There is a rhythm to quiet work that I have come to appreciate. You build something piece by piece. Most of the time no one notices. Then one day someone pulls a record, runs a search, or opens a document and realizes the structure has been there all along. And by then, it does not need defending. A few months ago, a younger woman contacted me through the company website asking if I would meet her for coffee. She said she was trying to start a small development firm, but felt like people around her kept assuming she was just helping someone else. I agreed to meet her. We sat at a small cafe not far from the office. She spoke quickly at first, explaining permits, investors, property surveys, all the small systems she was already managing quietly. I recognized the tone immediately. At one point, she stopped mid-sentence and said, "Sometimes I feel like no one is actually seeing what I'm building." I smiled a little and told her something simple. Keep building anyway. Because the truth is, the right people eventually notice the structure, and the wrong ones eventually run into it. If this story felt familiar to you, if you've ever been underestimated while quietly doing the work, I'm really glad you stayed and listened. Before you go, take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories we share here. And I'm always curious about the community listening along, so leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. 2 of our most popular stories are about to appear on your screen next, and they're worth hearing when you have a quiet moment. Until then, take care of yourself.